Hey everyone, and welcome to the channel. So right here we have an Associated B7 in its box. Right here we have an Associated B6.3 assembled. By the end of this video, this will be assembled and this will be a pile of bits. Now, I don't plan on doing a full step-by-step video of this build, but I will be stopping from time to time as I go through just to look at some of the changes that have been made on the B7 in comparison with the B6.3 and any other things that catch my attention. First step asks you to build up the steering assembly and the front bulkhead top. The geometry of the steering is very similar to the B6.3, same dimensions, although they've put some useful spacers on the mountings here that makes it easier to adjust the height of the crank depending on the caster and kick-up settings that you're using. One thing they have changed as well is the mounting of the anti-roll bar. It's a lot more robust using these collars to hold the roll bar in place. Just make sure that the roll bar stays nice and free rather than getting bound up. It's quite easy to tighten these up at the wrong angle and make everything lock up solid. Bag 2 includes the chassis, and this is one of the major differences between the B7 and the B6.3. This is the B7 chassis, this is the B6.3. Telltale that it's the B7 is this angle on the side here, which is very noticeable even after the side guards have been screwed on. But the more important things really are to do with the angles on the chassis. So we'll just line the two up side by side to start off with. Assume that the cutout for the diff is your best reference point. And if we work forward, we should see that the position of the slots milled into the angled sides here, which gives an indication of the battery adjustment positions, are very different. Sorry, there's big shadows here because of the light above, so I'll try and adjust that a little bit. The B6.3 has much more rearward possibilities for mounting the battery. Remember that this also gave you the option of running a stand-up style gearbox, as well as the two holes there for the lay back and lay down gearboxes. The B7 only has the one position for the motor, which moves the motor somewhere up here. Hence, there's much less movement for the battery. But as you can see, the default position for the battery is definitely a lot further forward. It's a smaller space for the electronics plate there, as you can see as well, and also a smaller space for the under servo weight. And looking at the kick up here, should hopefully be able to see the difference in the kick-up angle built into the chassis for the two. That's the B6.3 on the top. That's the B7 on the bottom. The B7 adopts the 22.5 degree kick-up angle that was introduced on the B6.4. I don't have the B6.4. The B6.3 used the earlier 27.5 degree kick-up angle on the chassis. That means that basically the default setting of the B7 is 5 degrees less kick-up, 5 degrees less caster, and the range of adjustment is affected in the same way from there on. Here's another view of the difference between the two chassis, and again it's very clear how much narrower the B7 chassis is compared to the B6.3 chassis. Again, that is because of the longer suspension arms and the much narrower suspension mountings that it needs to run as a result. A comparison now between the bulkheads. On the top is the B6.3 bulkhead, and this here is the B7 bulkhead. And if we measure the gaps, the B6.3 has a distance between the hinge pins of, should we say, 37 millimeters. And in comparison, the B7 bulkhead has a distance between the hinge pins of just 29 millimeters. A little more progress on the chassis and a few more interesting construction details with this. So they supply some foam tape there to allow you to put that into the chassis. This is the carpet version, but it's coming with the aluminium ESC weight rather than the steel one, so a little bit lighter weight, and doesn't come with an under servo weight in the box. A few details around the front as well as the aluminium bulkhead, which is 0 degrees in the box. They include these shims as well. There's 2 of them in the box, and the kit setting calls for you to add one of them. This is a bulkhead height adjustment. It's another roll center adjustment. Otherwise, it all goes together very well. Good build quality so far. And now we're on to one of the most interesting things, which is the front suspension arms. So here are those front suspension arms. On the right here, we have the suspension arms that were used on the B6.3 and also on the B6.4. And this fundamental geometry of arm has been in use ever since the B4 back in the early noughties that was released. And this is the brand new front arm for the B7. So let's get the calipers out and take a few measurements. Now the B6.3 arm and its predecessors is known to be a 73mm arm. The B7 arm is longer, but by how much? So I actually make it a 77.5mm arm. It's a bit hard to line up on camera, but I make it a 77.5mm arm. So 4.5mm longer than the B6.3 arm. And if you remember when we talked about the bulkhead width, the bulkhead is roughly 4mm per side narrower. This arm is about 4.5mm per side longer, so you're going to end up with the outer hinge bin being roughly at the same position as before. That might have some significance for the caster blocks, the new caster blocks. But another thing that I think is very interesting about these new arms is the position of the shock mounting holes. So again, if we just line the two arms up next to each other, we should be able to see that the most commonly used holes on a B6.3, which would be the middle and the outer one, even taking into account that the longer arm would naturally push them a bit further out, even the middle hole on the B6.3 is, if anything, slightly further in than the most inner hole on the B7, and then the B7 options get thicker, get stiffer from there, bearing in mind that the further out that you mount the suspension, the shock absorber on the suspension arm, the stiffer the wheel rate. So this arm on the B7 gives potential for a much stiffer wheel rate than we're used to with the B6.3 and B6.4 arms, so that's going to be interesting to see. Just for a rough comparison, I've already measured the B6.3. The middle hole is 40mm out, and the outer hole is about 43.5mm out. And if we just take the same measurement on the B7 arm, the inner hole about 42.5mm out, the middle hole then about 46.5, and the outer hole again in the region of 50mm out. So we're talking about, even taking into account that the arm is about 6 or 7% longer, these mounting holes are more than 6 or 7% further out, relatively speaking. So that's a very interesting development. Next thing of interest on the B7 is, of course, the KPI front steering system, KPI being kingpin inclination. And here we've got the 3 different steering uprights that are included in the kit. From left to right, this is the KPI 1, the KPI 2, KPI 3. Instructions call for the KPI 2 to be installed. The difference is, if you can tell, I'll just use this KPI 3 one here for example. The way that they get the inclination is by offsetting this hole here from this hole here. So in effect, the pivot runs an angle through it. And the idea again is that it comes closer to the contact patch of the tyre on the ground, which gives a different steering feel. There's 1mm difference in the offset between each one, with the KPI 1 having the least offset, and the KPI 1 is actually only 1mm off a vertical, a standard straight steering upright with no offset. And these, of course, bolt into the new C-hub, which is a pretty substantial affair. A few design changes on this one. They're bolting in a carbon plate on here, so it has a vertical ball stud, whereas previously the ball stud was attached horizontally on the top of the C-hub. And also the way that they accommodate the KPI geometry is that instead of having a classic top hat style piece going through here, there's actually going to be a pivot ball that pops in there to allow it to run at an angle and to allow you to have the inclination at different levels. Next up, I want to compare the completed caster and steering block assemblies on both the B6.3, which is on the left here, and on the new B7. Now you can tell that the B7 is a much more substantial assembly because of all the additional parts on it. But interestingly and helpfully, the key geometry is quite similar between the two. So the distance between the hinge pin here and the outer face of the steering upright is the same on both. So width-wise, you can interchange. You should hopefully be able to tell that the vertical offset between the two is basically the same as well. So you're not going to have the wrong ride height or roll center in that sense. Note as well that the B7 does share the same caster hat bushings that are used on the B6.3 and B6.4 to adjust the hub height on the front. Now the B7 does come with much wider hexes on it, so it does look wider out of the box, but you could adjust that quite easily. In fact, the only thing that doesn't seem to be directly comparable, again, steering geometry is pretty similar across both of them, but the height of the vertical ball here with the kit settings with a 2mm spacer, it is higher than the horizontal ball here on the older parts. Obviously there's no vertical adjustment here, so you would need to make a compromise with your setting here, probably have to remove some shims on the inner mounting just to get the equivalent if you did decide to use the old-fashioned vertical kingpin steering blocks from the B6.3 and the B6.4. Now the B6.4 does have slightly different geometry. I believe it's slightly longer here and slightly shorter here, but it's the same overall width. It just brought the kingpin, the virtual kingpin, out a bit close to the wheel, but it looks like there shouldn't be too many problems with running the B7 with the old non-inclined kingpins if you've got the parts available. Bag 4 introduces us to a few more of the new parts, so we'll start off by having a look at the front mount for the rear wishbones, what they call the C mount. So this here is the C mount of the B6.3, this here is the C mount of the B7. Visually, again, you can tell quite a big difference in the width between the hinge pins on both, and again I've measured it up, I won't do it on camera this time, but same differences on the front. This has got 37mm gap between the centers of the hinge pins, using a standard zero insert, of course. And this has got a 29mm gap. So again, it's 8mm in total narrower, 4mm on each side. And I've done the same thing again with the wishbones. The B6.3 comes with the 73mm wishbones. Associated kindly mark it on the actual wishbone. There is also a 75mm wishbone out there for the Associated cars, which was standard on the B62 and can be fitted as an option to other cars in the range as well. The B7 wishbone isn't reversible, unlike the B6.3 one, but the B7 wishbone, again, I measure it to length of 77.5mm, so the same effective length as on the front wishbones, and again this time it's got 3 mounting holes, which the B6.3 wishbone effectively has, although the B6.3 does it on 2 sides and you have to reverse it to get all of them. But to get an idea of the relative geometry here, I've done some quick measurements again off camera, and the innermost hole, which is one that you'd commonly use on rougher or low grip surfaces, is slightly further out on the B7 than on the B6.3. If anything, I would say that in terms of leverage, it's actually a little bit closer in. So not such a radical difference on the geometry of the rear shock positions as there is on the front. If we remember, the front has got some very stiff wheel rates built into the wishbones. This is much more akin to the wheel rates on the B6.3 and B6.4 and other buggies that are using the 73mm Associated arm. Bags 5 and 6 introduce a few more interesting parts for the drivetrain. So starting off with bag 5, which is the new gear diff. This uses the LTC gears on the inside, which are from the B74.2. Also an upgrade compared to the older cars is that this diff cover here is aluminium, so that should hopefully result in a slightly fewer leaks, although the gasket actually isn't located in position, so it's a little bit tricky to assemble the first time. We also have the changed motor mounts. This is the one off the B6.3. This is the one off the B7. It's a touring car style mount, as you can see. It removes all of this top area of the plate, and so from now on we will just be mounting the motor with the 2 holes down at the bottom. So if you're thinking of fitting a Mabuchi 540, I think you're going to be out of luck with this car. And the last thing of interest is, of course, the new 5-gear gearboxes. It's called a 5-gear gearbox because it includes 3 idler gears, 3 small idler gears. This is the lay down gearbox from a B6.3. It's also used on the B6.4, which uses 3 gears. That's the diff gear, that is a large idler gear, and then that is the input gear from the spur lay shaft. But yes, the B7 using 3 small idler gears. See how they're stacked, and one of them actually lies directly below the lay shaft. And what that means is that even though, as I say, more gears, there's actually only 10 millimeters difference in the position of the lay shaft. This is about 38 millimeters from the center of the diff to the lay shaft, and this new B7 gearbox is about 48 millimeters from the center of the diff up to the lay shaft. So more gears, but not a massive difference, a significant one, but not a massive difference in the position of the lay shaft. Another change is to the rear hubs. You now get the option of these high roll center hubs as well as the standard ones. The difference is that these are 2 millimeters taller, so the distance between the axle and the hinge pin is 2 millimeters more. This one here, the standard hub, matches the height of the hubs off the B6.3 and B6.4. This one an option on the B7 and the kit build, or creates a higher roll center. Again, that's something you might want to have on higher grip surfaces, and they retain the adjustment here by changing the insert, which again should give you 3 millimeters adjustment of the hinge pin itself, further fine tuning of the roll center. Okay, so now we'll take a look at the weight distribution on the different buggies. Here we have the B6.3. This is the standard B6.3, the Carpet and Astro spec buggy. And although it's not currently set up for carpet running, you can probably tell from the tyres it's been set up for outdoor running. It is pretty close to a standard setup. There's no special option parts on it to change the weight distribution. And as you might just be able to see from the Sky RC scales there, the total weight on this one is just over 1,500 grams, and there's no extra ballast on it, so it is a little bit over the minimum weight, which is 1474. And also from the weight distribution there, you can see 59% to the rear and 41% to the front. Now we'll take a look at another buggy. This is the Yokomo SO2. This one is set up for carpet racing, and also, as you can tell from the weight distribution, it does have the weight a little bit further forward. Total weight on this one is 1480 grams, so just over the minimum, and it does have a small amount of ballast in it to reach that weight. And the weight distribution is 57% over the rear axle and 43% over the front axle, again with very close to a kit build. And finally, we'll take a look at the weight distribution on the B7. Now, interestingly, even though this is built for mod spec with a low profile lipo, it's still a little bit overweight at 1493 grams. And interestingly, the weight distribution is still 43 front and 57 rear. So despite the change in layout, the weight distribution itself isn't actually that different to the Yokomo car. Bearing in mind this is the out-of-the-box setup and doesn't have any extra ballast added to the front, and the Yokomo does have some steel weights on the front out of the box. So now that I've finished building the car, what are my thoughts? Well, the first thing to mention, as you can probably tell from the length of this video, is that there are so many changes on this car, and it's been a really interesting build just seeing those changes. And more than that, Associated's engineers have done an amazing job of integrating all those changes into the build. The build experience is very, very good. The parts fitment is very, very good. So even though this car is almost completely different to the cars that preceded it, it feels like a very mature platform already. I'll go through the car in a little bit more detail in a moment with a few areas that you might want to watch for when you are building it, but I will just call out a couple of small disappointments for me on this one. The first one is a bit of a nitpick, but I nitpicked about the X-ray for the same reason, and that is that Associated didn't include a under servo weight with the car. It's just a space with some small holes in the bottom of the chassis, which I don't like to see. Having said that, the car is a little bit overweight. my other nitpick, and if they'd have included an under servo weight, the car would be even more overweight, which maybe isn't so desirable either. So I'll just quickly run through a few of the things that you might want to watch out for when you're building this car. So we'll start at the front. There is a little bit of confusion in the manual around the inserts in these caster blocks. One you should use is the 2.5 degrees, but it should be positioned in the plus 2.5 position, which means that the C-hubs are angled back. The manual suggests that maybe it should be minus, and that would push them forward. That's the wrong setting. It's designed to have them back, so you've got a total of 25 degrees of caster. The mountings on the anti-roll bars, although they are an upgrade and they're more like touring car mountings, they are a little bit fiddly to get the anti-roll bar rotating freely, so do take time to make sure that the anti-roll bar is rotating freely on those. As ever with any of these cars, take a little bit of time to make sure that the steering linkage works correctly for your servo. Not every servo is the same dimension. In my case, I just made the link a little bit longer. They suggest a 1mm spacer. I've gone for 2, which stops the ball end from hitting the steering bell cranks at full lock. And I've also taken a tiny bit of material away from the top brace here, just to make sure I keep the clearance for the steering servo horn here as well. The new battery mounts are a nice improvement in terms of being a more modern design, and these little tabs are good because they actually have a little O-ring here that holds them in place very well. One thing to watch out for again though is that these screws that come in the box are a little bit short. I would suggest getting some slightly longer ones for that, and also the tab for low profile is still a little bit too high for an ultra low profile lipo like this one, so I've put a little bit of foam in there to take that gap out. And the last thing to mention is the gearbox mouldings, and in fact most of the large mouldings, also the side rails and the servo mount. Now there have been a few people online saying that the gearbox mouldings don't line up properly. I don't think that's correct. I think that with any large moulding, what you need to do is you need to connect the screws fairly loosely to get all the parts aligned. So put all the screws in fairly loosely. Then when everything is lined up, do your full tighten and the gearbox will come together as it's intended to. It's pretty common for large mouldings to distort a little bit when they come out of the mould, perfectly normal. So just as ever with any build, just take your time and the car will come together as expected. A few thoughts on the kit setup of this B7. This is obviously aimed at high grip carpet racing, which is common in the United States. So the front suspension setup is very stiff. The rear suspension setup is actually surprisingly soft. So I'm expecting to go stiffer on the rear and also softer on the front for the medium grip tracks that I race on. Also, the geometry is set up the way you'd expect for high grip, with high roll centers at the rear and at the front, a relatively low ride height, and limited rear toe in at just 1 degree. I'm not expecting to make large changes to the geometry. It seems about right out of the box. In terms of performance, we've already seen that the car is fast in the hands of the pros, but then again, every car is fast in the hand of the pros. So I'll be looking forward to giving this a run over the next few weeks, seeing how I get along, seeing what changes I need to make to get the car where I want to be, and more importantly, seeing whether I'm fast with it as well. As ever, I hope you found this video useful. If you've got any questions or comments, please place them down below. If you've enjoyed the video, please like the video and consider subscribing. It really helps me out. Otherwise, as ever, thank you very much for watching.